Hi, I'm Old Norse specialist Dr. Jackson Crawford. Over the past millennium, it's well known that two great world languages, English and French, have interacted constantly and intimately. It's also fairly well known that Old Norse, the language of the Vikings, profoundly influenced the history of English and much of the most basic vocabulary used in this language today. What's less well known is that a great deal of French vocabulary comes from Old Norse, and I'm going to talk about some favorite examples today. So this is part of a series of videos answering questions from my Patreon supporters. Thank you, Patreon, for keeping this 9-year running channel going and keeping me going for the last 9 years. This comes from a question posed by Matt Carnavalo, so thank you, Matt. Now, the influence on French is not as deep as on English. English vocabulary includes words like they and them, which actually ultimately come from Old Norse, as well as basic verbs like get, give, and take. French has less deep and, for the most part, less basic vocabulary borrowings, and a lot of those vocabulary borrowings are limited to northern dialects. That's exactly where you would expect that Old Norse influence to be strongest. After all, Normandy is originally the duchy of the Northmen, sounds almost the same in Old Norse and English, who settled there beginning legendarily with a leader named Rollo. Now, Rollo is not an Old Norse name, that is an Old French hearing of an Old Norse name. The Old Norse name is probably Hrolleifr, that would be like fame, survivor. Same name that becomes Rolf in later English, German, Scandinavian contexts. But even though a lot of these borrowings are limited to Norman French and other Norman dialects, a surprising amount have reached mainstream everyday French as well. And quite a bit of those borrowings from Old Norse ultimately wind up in English because of the profound influence of French on English, both Norman French in the Middle Ages and Parisian Standard French in the early modern period. So a great example is the word equip. English borrows this word from French équiper. We pronounce it quite differently because we tend to pronounce the U's after Q's rather than taking that as a Q before an I, just pronounce it as a K. But if you look at the French pronunciation, and by the way, folks, Old Norse specialist, speaker of modern Scandinavian languages, not a speaker of French. My attempts are respectful, but I am sure they don't sound perfect. I got along in Montreal okay, Montreal, but I know I don't sound great speaking French. So équipe, that is from Old Norse skippa. Now that may not look likely, but consider something like Latin scola, school, and how that goes into a word in French like écolier, scholar, student. What's happened in French is a sequence of ska in Latin becomes a sequence ek. This is actually not too different from what happens in Spanish, except that ska just becomes esc, right? Escuela from scola. So what's happened is actually French has a medium stage like Spanish where this was like esquipa or escolier, but then the S drops. So skippa to esquipa to équipe. Now in Old Norse, skippa is supply a ship, and that's what équipe originally means in French, but later comes to mean supply something else, right? Whatever supplies you need or your equipment. So that equip root, in fact, comes from the Old Norse word for ship. Now, by the way, if you want to dig into a lot of French influence words, a lot of words in French influenced by Old Norse, there's a whole book about this which I've enjoyed. It's by Elisabeth Gledel, and it's called Les Vikings élément, and it's fairly easily available from European booksellers when they are shipping to the United States, which has been difficult in the last few months. Another good one is French archaic, rigging and apparatus, especially for a ship or an athletic activity. You may notice that a lot of these things have to do with ships. Not surprising given the context of Norse activities in northern France. This comes from Old Norse greve, equipment, tools, or trapping, so no surprise there. A little bit unsurprising too would be vague in French, meaning a wave. This is not the same as the adjective that's borrowed in English is like vague. That's from Latin, vagus. But that is from Old Norse vågr, which in early poetic language means wave. Now, in the later standard prose language that we read in the sagas in the 1200s, vågr means bay rather than wave. But what's interesting is very often the meanings of words borrowed into French have more archaic senses than we see in the sagas. That makes perfect sense because they're being borrowed from the language of Vikings 300 or 400 years before the Icelanders who were writing down the sagas. So no big surprise. And I'll come back to another good example of that in a minute after I mention to you someone else besides Patreon who keeps this channel going, and that is Grimfrost. The great craftsman at Grimfrost. See my fun interview with Johan Hegg from there and from Amona Marth a few months ago. Support this channel, and you can support me by supporting them. Great place to shop for holiday gifts for anybody interested in Old Norse stuff, and they have a daily deal during the month of December on, some cool item is on discount every day. So stop by, pick up one of my books maybe, pick up something for a friend or loved one, and tell them you came from here. All right, so another example of an Old Norse word preserved in an archaic sense, or frankly just a very archaic word that we don't otherwise see, is Old Norse flâneur, a word that we see in poetry that means like move heedlessly, like, go rushing off without direction. And that is borrowed into French as flâner, wander around or loiter. And of course, that gives us one of the great French cultural words, flâneur, the loafer or idler. So I think that it's pretty funny that something that we associate quite a bit with, a Parisian cafe, perhaps where one would sip wine and watch people steal stuff from the Louvre, would be a word that ultimately comes from Old Norse. I guess the Louvre burglars were like Vikings in a sense, right? That's interesting. Now some unexpected ones. How about duvet? Borrowed into English as duvet, right? Like a blanket, a down comforter type thing. That is supposed to come from Old Norse dun, meaning down feathers. In Old French, this is attested as dumet, probably with the M rather than N, influenced by plume, feather. I am not exactly sure how the M to V sound change is accounted for. I'm told by Romance linguist Dr. Luke Gordon at the University of New Mexico that is not a standard French sound change, but this does seem to be the accepted etymology for duvet. Oddly enough, when you bed down and get comfortable with your duvet, you're using a French word from Old Norse. Another one, maybe slightly less unexpected, but also really fun, is rogue, right? Haughty, the word that gives us rogue in English. That is in fact from Old Norse hrokur, which means rook, right? The crow-like bird of Europe. And now crow-like, raven-like birds are kind of known for their haughty, jaunty behavior and cast of mind. And so that is apparently what gives this adjective / noun in French from that Old Norse expression. In fact, in Icelandic to this day, there is a phrase, hrokur als fagnadar, the rook of all joy. It's like the life of the party. So kind of a similar extension, although I guess he's not the rogue of the party. One that I'm interested in for linguistic research is regret. This is borrowed into English from French regretter, right, which means to regret. It also means to miss in French, a sense that you don't see in modern English. Now, this appears to be from the Old Norse word gråta, to weep, and in Völuspá, the first poem in the Poetic Edda, we read that Frigg gret, Frigg wept, and that appears to have some kind of iterative or intensive sense in early Old Norse poetry. I've been working a lot on what these little words and ov mean, and it appears that the French re, that prefix that's inserted onto the word in French, is duplicating the sense of that intensive or reduplicative prefix in Old Norse. I find that really fascinating. It suggests that during the, say, 900s AD, when this word is borrowed into French from Old Norse, that prefix small function word still has that function. It's not a functionless, quote, filler word like people usually assume such words are in Old Norse. I've talked quite a bit about that in some videos and in the introduction to my second edition of the Poetic Edda, where I explain how my changing views on these words have affected a lot of my translations, and I've revised them accordingly. Well, I hope that's an interesting intro to some fun vocabulary in French that's surprisingly sourced from Old Norse and then passed on to English in a form that you would never guess was actually from the language of the Vikings. Thanks, Matt, for the question. Thanks all of Patreon for the support. Thanks, Grimfrost, for the support. Thanks to those checking out my books, especially the second edition of the Poetic Edda. It is 100 pages longer, much revised. I think it would make a fantastic gift for a friend or family member interested in Norse stuff. You can also order signed copies delivered to you from Boulder Bookstore if you live in the USA, Canada, or Australia. For now, I won't attempt to do a sign-off in French. I know that won't please anybody. But from beautiful Colorado, I'm wishing you all the best.